good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. We love when books are on our program, and we're always excited when an author stops by. So when a familiar face to Fence, Ethan Tapper, comes to talk about his book, How to Love a Forest, we greeted him with open arms. What we didn't know about Ethan was when he's not writing books or walking the woods, he's singing and plays guitar in a 10-piece punk band. 2024 was a busy year for Tapper. His book came out in September, and his band, The Bubs, released their album Make a Mess a month earlier. We started our conversation talking about Tapper's radical roots as a forester, which line up, not surprisingly, with his taste in music.
In our description of you, we described you as kind of a radical, and that kind of comes through in the book a little bit. It's not just because of your punk credentials. Can you tell us why you say that?
You know, I think a lot of the book is about exploring this radical idea of what it means to love a forest. Now, you might think that might mean we should leave forests alone and just sort of let nature take its course, but actually, what I talk about a lot in the book is that our forests are really struggling, and they're facing all of these, harmful legacies of the past, these challenges of the present, and this uncertain future. And what we need to do is to help them, and that contains, a lot of different things. It might mean cutting trees, which to think that cutting a tree could be something that's positive for a forest is kind of a radical idea.
And you say you're a self-described radical even before it comes to forestry. Can you tell me kind of how that process started?
Well, I just think that I like to think about these issues in a broader way. Sometimes it's sort of radical to think about, instead of dealing with, like, maybe in my field, how forestry is practiced, how we've traditionally done things, to think about how we can reimagine forests, how we can reimagine what it means to care for them, and sort of turn over and reimagine a lot of these practices that are commonplace, and turn them into something that's maybe more appropriate or more helpful to our ecosystems.
And the subtitle of your book is actually, it's quite beautiful. It's The Bittersweet Work of Tending a Changing World, and you kind of describe that early on in the book with a couple of sugar maples and a beech tree. And I've read a little bit of the book myself, and while it sounds like it handles some more radical topics, it definitely doesn't sound very radical to me. So can you tell me a little bit more about that process?
I think it's the simplest thing in the world, really. We just live in this place. We're all dependent upon ecosystems for the air that we breathe and for the water that we drink and for this climate that we inhabit, and they need help. And so, maybe it's a radical idea to think that help could look like something like cutting a tree, but really it's simple. We live in this world, it needs help. What are we going to do to help it?
And there's a lot of sentimentality in this book, but there's also some reality that logging is one of the more dangerous professions out there. Is that the case for somebody, an at-home logger, or somebody who does it as a profession?
Sure. I mean, I think, the risk that I put myself at when I'm cutting trees, or that the loggers that I work with put themselves at every day in the woods is no joke. But for me, like when I'm working on my own land, it's so important, this work that we do, that for me, that risk, I'm always very careful, but it's not the first thing that I think about. It's always in the background, but I'm like, this is what we got to do. And I'm happy to take those risks to help, my forest or the forest that I manage be healthier.
And the book is separated up, as you well know, by different keywords. Like, for example, one of them is the word change.
Yeah.
And in that chapter, you talk about history and landscape and certain destruction, even windstorms some. So how did you, and maybe even an editor, kind of decide how to frame the book through these different words?
As I was writing the book, there was a lot of different things I wanted to talk about, and these key words just kept on coming out. Some of the other big ones are like relationship. What is our relationship to forests and other ecosystems? Responsibility. What is our responsibility to forests and other ecosystems? Humility. How can we have the humility to acknowledge that forests are already beautiful and already vital, and that we may never even totally understand them, and then the courage to do stuff to help them anyway. Legacy. What is our legacy that we're going to leave for future generations? What is the legacies that we inherit from the past? And it just really felt like a way that we could frame a lot of these topics in an engaging way.
And throughout the book, you always have one thing by your side, and that's your chainsaw. Do you see that as kind of a means to cure or to cut?
It is both. And I think that one of the things that I really like the parody of is that, my forest, Bear Island, which I talk a lot about in the book, was very degraded by short-sighted logging practices, what we call high grading, which is where you just basically cut all of the healthiest, most valuable trees in the forest, and you leave the least healthy trees behind, which is a really great way to degrade a forest. And now I'm using the same tools that those loggers used, a chainsaw, a skidder, to then heal the forest. So there's a lot of things like that that I think it's important for people to understand is like, we have all this almost trauma from the way that ecosystems have been managed by people in the past. But it doesn't mean that we have to be a harmful influence on our forest. I really think that we can be a keystone species, that we are probably ecosystems' best hope to have a better future. And we can acknowledge the harm that's been caused by people in the past, and also we can change.
And speaking of that ecosystem, hunting is a lot of people spend time in the woods hunting, of course, and you kind of talk about that relationship in your chapter, Relationships, the Doe Hunter. And I would love if you don't mind reading a passage from that,
Sure.
Kind of about the bittersweet idea of that combination and maybe the radical things that you were talking about.
Sure. As the hunters of Vermont age and retire, I imagine future generations of hunters like me, who hunt not for bigger bucks and more deer, but for a sustainable population of deer on the landscape. As the loggers of Vermont age and retire, I imagine future generations of loggers like me, who cut trees so forests will be healthy and diverse and resilient, a richer legacy for future generations. I am the doe hunter, to whom hunting is an act of humility and an act of love. I am the doe hunter who sees beauty in a living deer and a dead deer, in living trees and trees stacked on the log landing ready to be sent to the mill. I am the doe hunter choosing complexity over simplicity, responsibility over comfort. I am the doe hunter, a brave and imperfect being in a world of nuance. I am the doe hunter. Like this world, I am many things at once.
So you draw a lot of parallels between being a hunter and being a logger. Do you think for you personally, you're a better hunter because you're a logger or vice versa?
I think that both things to me have a lot of similarities. You know, I want to acknowledge that for most people to cut a tree or to kill a deer, you know, how could that be part of how we love a forest? How could that be part of how we care for an ecosystem? They're these incredibly bittersweet acts that also are incredibly necessary. You know, it's like in the same way that we may acknowledge that our forests are degraded and that using the cutting of a tree as a tool, we can help them heal. We can acknowledge that, like, deer don't have any predators on our landscape except for people, and that deer overpopulation is a major threat to our ecosystems. And, you know, as bittersweet as it feels, the killing of a deer can be this incredibly beautiful thing. But for both of those things, you know, there are hunters and there are loggers who are doing such amazing work and are really helping our ecosystems. And also, I'm really interested in seeing future generations of hunters and future generations of loggers who are not just killing trees, not just killing deer, but who are doing those things with a more holistic understanding of, like, let's not have the most deer we possibly can. Let's have a sustainable relationship, a sustainable population of deer in our landscape. Let's not cut the biggest trees that we find. Let's see how we can use logging as a tool to benefit our ecosystems.
And it sounds like there aren't just parallels between being a logger and a hunter, but also even in the outcome to maintaining a forest. It sounds like helping maintain deer population is an important part of forest management.
Incredibly vital. And I think that, you know, one thing with this book that I try to do is it's a love letter to forests. It's a love letter to my land, Bear Island. I want people to see how much I love these things and how I care for them intrinsically. It's not just about what I can take from them. It's really this relationship that I have with them where I will do anything necessary to help them. And then I want people to understand how when I do these counterintuitive things, like cutting a tree, like killing a deer, how that's an expression of that love.
And now let's talk about Bear Island. You've mentioned it a couple times. It's not actually an island, though I suppose it might feel like that. It's a 175-acre parcel of land where you live and work. So can you tell me a little bit about Bear Island and what it means to you?
Bear Island was such a cool catalyst for a lot of the ideas that I talk about in the book, because I bought it in 2017. And when I first walked there, my impression was there are no healthy trees here, because it had been high graded, because it had been so degraded. It had a really bad infestation of non-native invasive plants, deer overpopulation, all these skid trails and roads that were rutted and eroding, and it just seemed like a forest that had every problem that a forest could have. And I had to ask myself if it would be a greater act of compassion toward this forest to leave it alone and to just let it suffer, or to do everything that I could to make it healthy again. And over the last even just 7 years, as I've managed it and I've done all these sort of like bittersweet and counterintuitive things, I've seen it change so dramatically for the better. And so now I really see it as a symbol of what is possible, which is, a symbol of what we can do if we take action, and if we take responsibility for the ecosystems that we have and say, okay, these things that I have to do, maybe they make me a little uncomfortable, but what if I do them anyway? And what if I really, really ask the question of what does it mean to love a forest?
And you mentioned these uncomfortable and radical things, and more than just cutting a tree, which you've already mentioned, what does that look like, especially for Bear Island?
Cutting a tree, killing deer. One thing that I talk about in a chapter about biodiversity is like using herbicide on non-native invasive plants, which is incredibly confusing and doesn't make any sense to a lot of people who love forests, but also is probably our only hope to protect our biodiversity from these non-native invasive plants, which are this existential threat to our ecosystems and something that basically all the conservation organizations in Vermont use as a tool. So all of those things, I want to acknowledge that they're very confusing and counterintuitive, and all of those things to me, sort of the more confusing they are, the more radical they seemed, the more radical expressions of love for my forest.
And we're almost out of time, but one more thing about Bear Island. Do you think of a forest as a garden that needs to be tended and you'll always have to take care of it? Or at some point, do you think your work with Bear Island and its conservation will be done?
I think that, if we're clear-eyed about the future that we're moving into, that our ecosystems are always going to need a little bit of help. And that's okay, but I really look forward to a time when Bear Island needs less help, and when I can work on it and manage it, and within the context of a really healthy, vibrant ecosystem again.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And you can find How to Love a Forest at any of your local libraries or wherever you get books. And that takes care of our program for today. My thanks and love to everyone at WCAX who makes our program possible. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.